So this morning our presentation was called Metrics Everywhere. And the goal of the study was really to understand how behavioral metrics could essentially serve as proxies for measuring a lot of our traditional campaign objectives. So we wanted to get a sense of whether these new behavioral metrics that are available to us in digital advertising, whether they can actually represent success across traditional brand metrics.
Just quickly, give me some examples of these new behavioral metrics.
So some examples would be basically with the advent of digital advertising, there's been a whole new set of behavioral metrics that are available for advertisers to measure the success of their campaigns. And some of these metrics could be, how does exposure increase someone's likelihood to conduct a search for a brand? Or how does exposure to advertising increase someone's likelihood to engage with a brand online, whether it's through site visitations or deeper engagement, such as page views on an advertiser's site. So we know these metrics are important, and we know that they're significant because they demonstrate very genuine consumer interest in a brand. And we can tie that to exposure to the advertising. But what we don't necessarily know is where these metrics line up with traditional brand objectives. So a lot of marketers haven't necessarily adopted these new metrics because there are a lot of campaign metrics that are very standard, like surveys, that you can measure stuff like awareness, favorability, likelihood to purchase, and purchase intent. And there are also data sources where you can get purchase data from. But what we're trying to do is show that these behavioral metrics can actually more scalably and more easily serve as proxies for measuring traditional brand metrics.
Can we get into some specific behavioral metrics?
Yeah, so some of the behavioral metrics that we looked at were search lifts, site visitation, and page views. And so we looked at these behaviors combined. So it turns out that these behaviors are actually really related, regardless of the category that we were looking at. And what we wanted to do is conduct a multivariate regression to understand how predictive changes in these metrics are of changes in brand and purchase metrics. And that's essentially what the study did. And we looked at over 100 campaigns across 4 different categories. And we actually found differences by category. So basically, we found that our behavioral metrics actually do signify changes in brand and purchase metrics, and they actually can be predictive of those changes. But it actually differs by category. So for example, in, retail, in retail and CPG, food and grocery, we actually found that there was really no relationship between our behavioral metrics and brand metrics. And if anything, our behavioral metrics were much more indicative of lower funnel activity like purchase. So in categories like retail and CPG, food and grocery, if advertisers only adopt survey metrics, they're really only capturing half of the effect of their campaign. They're not really seeing the whole, they don't have as much latitude in terms of understanding how their campaign affected both brand perceptions and near-term purchase. Because in those categories, our behavioral metrics are much more correlated with near-term purchase than they are with brand. In other categories, we actually see very strong correlations between brand metrics and behavioral metrics. So two examples where we actually see brand metrics and behavioral metrics really highly correlated with each other are in the CPG health and beauty categories, as well as the computer and tech categories. And in these categories, we actually see really strong relationships between an advertiser driving success in our behavioral metrics and that corresponding, and actually consistently corresponding with changes in brand metrics. So in these categories, we could actually see that our behavioral metrics could really serve as a proxy for measuring brand success. And then there's some categories where everything's related, where behavioral is related to brand metrics, and where changes in behavior are also related to purchase. And an example of that is QSR. And in QSR, we actually see that our behavioral metrics are really highly predictive of purchase. But
can you just quickly define QSR for people?
I'm sorry, QSR would be quick service restaurants. So in the quick service restaurant category, we actually see really strong relationships between changes in our behavioral metrics and changes in near-term purchase. But we also see really strong relationships between our behavioral metrics and changes in our brand metrics as well. So basically, in this category, everything's related. But our behavioral metrics are by far the strongest predictor of success in terms of driving immediate sales versus any other metrics. What we'd like to recommend advertisers to do is to actually start collecting a lot more brand and behavioral metrics so they can start understanding for themselves how these metrics are related to each other. Eventually, I think what this is going to allow them to do is really simplify the metrics that they use in order for campaign measurement. Ideally, it's going to result in a few less surveys, because right now there's just way too many surveys going on online right now. So it would be great if we could actually start using a lot of these behavioral proxies as a way to determine success. Given the findings of what we have right now, we feel like we have a really high-level understanding of how these relationships work. And if needed, I think brands can actually start using behaviors right now as proxies. We provided a great one-sheet, and I think it's going to be available on advertising.yahoo.com for anyone that wants to see the results to this study. And I think it's going to be very enlightening in terms of really trying to understand. I think like I said, we've always known that these behavioral metrics are important, but we don't always know how they relate to success across traditional campaign objectives. And so I think that's what this research really takes the first step in doing. That said, a lot more research needs to be done in terms of really getting a comprehensive understanding of how these metrics all relate to each other.
Have you done any studies around things like ad retargeting and maybe what type of goals an advertiser has where ad retargeting is really good and where it may not be as good?
So this doesn't necessarily relate as much to ad retargeting. This just more is a way to understand if we can start identifying proxy metrics to lessen our dependence on things like surveys in order for an advertiser to understand how their campaign succeeded against really traditional objectives. So this study is really meant for brand advertisers so that they can start understanding how they can start measuring the success of their brand campaigns online without necessarily having to do surveys. Now, we're not at the point where we can get rid of surveys entirely, but I think we are at a point to understand that these metrics do relate and that eventually they can serve as proxies. There just needs to be a lot more work done in that area.
And the goal there would be to reduce the costs associated with surveys.
It's not even so much even the cost associated with surveys, but it's also just the user experience. I mean, coming from a publisher's perspective, there are just way too many surveys being delivered online, and that really interrupts the user experience. And it also potentially even lessens the quality of the research itself. So I think surveys are never going to go away, and we're not advocating that they do. In fact, we're very big fans of surveys at Yahoo. But for advertisers, I think there just needs to be more options in terms of measuring success, because surveys aren't always possible, whether it's because the money isn't there to do the surveys, you're not getting cooperation from a publisher, or there just isn't time to set up a survey. And in those situations, we actually feel that behavioral metrics can start being used as proxies in order to understand campaign success. And also in terms of campaign optimization, a lot of times advertisers right now are currently optimizing campaigns based on click-through rate, which is fine, but depending on what your objective is, if your objective is raising awareness, then using something like a search lift might actually be more appropriate to optimize your campaign as opposed to click-through rate, because in a lot of our campaigns we actually saw search was really highly correlated with awareness. So we basically want to get a better understanding of what these behavioral metrics mean. Again, we know they're valuable, we just don't necessarily know what they signify in terms of achieving success against traditional campaign metrics. And that's really the goal that we're trying to do, and help advertisers adopt more of these types of metrics moving forward.